Spoken brother, Honorable Akin Rotimi Jr., the honorable members, especially my brothers who are with us to support me. One has spoken, Honorable Jafaru Gamboleko, who took over from me in the House of Representatives, and Honorable AKY Makama, my neighbor in Bauchi State, a member representing Alkalere and Kirifi Federal Constituency of Bauchi State. He has been introduced, Honorable Albert Aturicha, who was a member of the Fifth Assembly. But let me also acknowledge the chairman, NUG Abuja, the Iron Lady. She spoke quite forcefully and poignantly. Grace EK, Chairman, House of Representatives Press Corps, Comrade Boyega Onadran. We have also here the essay to the Executive Chairman, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, Mr. Olufemi. Let me bring this home. The essay media, Mr. Turaki Hassan, who is a part, I believe, once a member of the House Press Corps, always a member of the House Press Corps. He is an alumni of this institution. The members of the House Press Corps, we thank you for the work you do for our democracy, for keeping us informed, for amplifying the voices of the representatives of the people. Although occasionally we may not recognize you as such, we may not acknowledge it, but honestly, you are doing a hell of work for the survival and sustenance of our democracy. I understand the Chief Press Secretary to the Right Honorable Speaker is with us, and the Chief Press Secretary to the Deputy Speaker. You are all acknowledged. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Let me say that when I got this information, I thought to myself that I was going to dedicate 2 hours for the event. Unfortunately, we started a bit late. I have some other engagements that I will run to immediately after I'm done going through the text of the lecture today. But because this is a lecture, it's not a speech, it's expected to dwell more on the subject matter. I've taken time to address some of the topical questions that could come after a lecture like this. So as soon as I'm done talking to you, I would like to hand over to our able Chairman, House Committee on Media, and perhaps the essay to the Executive Chairman, the Federal Inland Revenue, to pick over pieces of our discourse in this place. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is both a privilege and a profound responsibility to stand before you today to speak on a topic that sits at the very heart of our nation's economic destiny, navigating tax reform in Nigeria, insights on President Bola Tinubu's policies. Permit me to first of all profusely thank the organizers of this event, the House of Representatives Press Corps, for deciding that we will not be addressing some abstract subject matter, but that we talk about the lifeblood of our national aspirations, the fuel for our infrastructure, our education, our healthcare, and our security. that we should talk about the new rules of the game as it affects us as individual citizens and for every single business in the country. From the multinational giant headquartered in Lagos to the innovative startups in Aba, whether we merely survive this change or we thrive because of it is solely dependent on how we collectively navigate this new frontier. Before delving into the subject matter proper, it is important to provide some context so that we don't think the reform came out of the blues or that it was some kind of ego trip embarked upon by the government. By the time President Tinubu took office, the economic debris of this nation had become too conspicuous to be ignored. 22.7 trillion, we're all journalists here, we know this, had been printed and injected into the economy in the name of ways and means, thereby destroying the value of the naira in our pockets. Also, the dual exchange rate meant that some anointed people were making hundreds of millions of naira of forex allocations from the CBN, which is Central Bank of Nigeria, without producing any goods or offering any services whatsoever. And also tying our crude sales to foreign loans in the name of forward sales of crude was fast becoming the order of the day. Some of the foreign loans had been procured in order to help strengthen the value of the naira, a measure that could only be sustained by what experts call voodoo economics. So from day one, it was very clear that something urgent, nay, revolutionary, must be done to prevent our economy from imploding. So the president's job as an economic reformer began on day one. Now, every reformer knows that progress is not promised, it is fought for. All that a reformer is actually bothered about is to do the right things, not to have everything under control. As a matter of fact, if everything seems under control, it is not only an indication that you are not going fast enough, you are most probably not a reformer. As a tested Democrat, Mr. President also knows that for our economy to be worth its name, for our democracy solely to be worth its name, it must offer more than political and individual freedoms. It must offer economic choices which will lead to economic justice, most especially for the vulnerable who are least likely to recover from economic shocks. In order to reform our obsolete tax laws, Mr. President set up the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reform, chaired by a renowned Nigerian, distinguished Nigerian, Professor Taiwo Oyedele. The committee came up with revolutionary reform proposals which will ultimately lead to restructuring of our laws, norms, and institutions to create a more just and equitable society. These involve a multifaceted approach of raising awareness, building support, and overcoming resistance. Reform efforts often face significant opposition from those who benefit from the status quo, requiring strategic planning, persistent advocacy, and coalition building to overcome these obstacles. This was no exception. The opposition to the reform was fierce and furious, almost fostering negative solidarity, which could lead to a race to the bottom and collective decline where everyone is forced to endure worsening conditions because no one feels capable of improving them. While I want to avoid interrogating motives, at some point it was clear that most of those opposed to the reform desired to see the president fail than succeed. Therefore, they raised issues that, even if true, were trivial. But as it related to the core goals of the reform, the issues were both trivial and untrue. It was clear that the opposition was primarily motivated by something sinister other than a collective benefit or shared ideal. Casting the president as dictatorial rather than being decisive was the high point of the opposition meant to scupper the reforms. Thankfully, Mr. President courageously held his line and refused to budge, and that is why we're here today. Thanks to his courage. For decades, our tax system had been a complex, sometimes contradictory web of ordinances and acts. It was a system where too few shouldered the burden of too many, where enforcement was inconsistent, and where informality was the norm, not the exception. The goals of these reforms are ambitious and frankly necessary. Nigeria's 2025 tax reform package is the most audacious overhaul of our fiscal framework in decades, and in response to long-standing fragmentation in the country's tax laws and administration. The stated goals are to simplify the legal framework, broaden the tax base, strengthen compliance, and align selected rules with international tax practices. The Presidential Committee, in its own words, summarized the goal of the reforms thus: they protect the poor, empower businesses, encourage investment, and ensure fairness across society. They strengthen Nigerians' competitiveness, reduce inequality, and provide the government with the resources needed to invest in infrastructure, education, health, and security. The reform forms part of a broader fiscal strategy that accompanies fuel subsidy removal and exchange rate unification introduced by the President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's administration since 2023. I believe this is a vision we can all, in principle, support, because a stronger Nigeria benefits all of us. This paper attempts to outline the key reforms, evaluate likely impacts on taxpayers, domestic and foreign, and provide practical guidance for businesses and advisors navigating the transition. To navigate the tax reforms, we need to know the changes so that as taxpayers or tax administrators, we can optimize the benefits for ourselves and the nation at large. The reform replaced and consolidated 16 federal tax statutes into 4 principal acts, as itemized below. 1, the Nigerian Tax Act NTA 2025, which consolidated all income transaction and instrument tax provisions into 1. Nigerian Tax Administration Act NTAA 2025, which modernized tax assessment, collection, dispute resolution, and compliance rules. The third is the Nigerian Revenue Service Establishment Act 2025, which established a central federal revenue agency to simplify tax administration. The fourth is the Joint Revenue Board Establishment Act 2025, which harmonized federal state revenue sharing and coordination mechanisms. The new provisions in the Nigerian Tax Act NTA 2025 include the following. For some of us who have not read this law, I've taken time to crystallize not all, but some of the most important aspects of the law. It relates to consolidation of tax law, replaces multiple legacy statutes, including Companies Income Tax Act, Personal Income Tax Act, Petroleum Profits Tax Act, VAT Act, Capital Gains Tax Act, and Stamp Duties Act with a unified, modern legislative framework. The expanded tax base brought digital services, virtual currencies, prices, honoraria, grants, in the words, and forex gains into taxable income definitions. Levy of 4% replaces multiple levies of TED fund, Naseni, IT, police trust fund, etc., with a single 4% levy on assessable profits. Introducing minimum effective tax rate of 15% that applies to large companies with turnover 50 billion, part of MNCs with global turnover of $750 million. If actual tax falls short, a top-of tax applies. Capital gains tax reforms, rate raised from 10% to 30% for companies, now applies to indirect share transfers, including those via offshore structures, broader assets categories, for example, crypto, patents, FX gains are all captured. Deals with also anti-avoidance measures relating to top-of tax, ensures global minimum effective taxation on profits of Nigerian parent companies, introduces CFC rules, taxes undistributed profits of controlled foreign companies. It expanded nexus for non-resident companies, NRCs, broadened permanent establishment and significant economic presence definitions, including physical and service delivery footprints. It taxes profits, services, disposals, even outside Nigeria, if they are economically linked. Minimum tax for NRCs, either withholding tax or 4% flat on Nigerian source income. Personal income tax, PIT enhancement, refined residency test, residence tax globally, non-resident tax on Nigerian source income, new taxable streams, for instance, digital gains and prices, defined valuation rules for benefits in kind, rent relief and reduced exemptions realigned, progressive rates of up to 25% with low income threshold clarified. Then we'll deal with research and development. It is a deduction limit to 5% of turnover, down from 10% of profit. Interest deductibility now applies restriction on all related parties, not just foreign ones. Collective investment schemes, for instance, mutual funds, now taxed under corporate tax regime. Reinsurance rules aligned with NECOM recapitalization standards. Several tax exemptions were granted under the NTA 2025 as hereunder. Companies with annual turnover of 100 million naira and fixed assets of 250 million naira are fully exempted from company income tax CIT, capital gain tax CGT, and 4% development levy. CGT exemptions for small share transfers for gains from share disposals where proceeds are under 150 million naira and the gain under 10 million naira within any 12-month period. Moreover, if proceeds are reinvested in other Nigerian company shares with the same assets within the same assessment year, the gain is exempt or taxed only proportionately when amounts exceeded the reinvested portion. The previous pioneer status is replaced with an economic development incentive, EDI, where eligible companies get a 5% tax credit per annum on qualifying capital expenditure for up to 5 years, with carry forward provision extendable another 5 years. Entities operating in tax-free zones exporting 75% or more of their goods and services are exempted from the minimum tax. A special relief for upstream oil sector operators grants them tax credit up to 20% of their annual tax liabilities, contingent on demonstrated cost-saving efficiencies. Education, materials, healthcare, and medicines and rent are exempted from VAT. Income exemption for individuals earning 800,000 or less annually are fully exempt from both personal income tax, PIT, and capital gains tax, CGT. Loss of office compensation, exemption for compensation received for loss of employment or personal injury is tax exempt up to 50 million naira, up from previous 10 million naira. Rent relief deduction for salaried individuals, like some of us can now deduct rent up to 500,000 naira or 20% of annual rent paid, whichever is lower. Provided actual rent is paid, homeowners are not eligible to pay VAT on rent received, as VAT is a consumption tax and payable by the tenant in the case of rent. New provisions in the Nigeria Tax Administration Act, NTAA 2025 are as follows. It simplifies filing for low-income earners, individuals earning 5 million or less solely from salary and allowances may qualify for simplified automatic tax filing procedures. A unified taxpayer identification number, UTIN, or TIN, is now mandatory for all taxable individuals, standardizing taxpayer identity across income types. For businesses exceeding small company threshold, the CIT rate is reduced from 30% to 25%. Electronic fiscal systems, e-invoicing, real-time VAT transmission have been introduced to enable digital enforcement. VAT regime has been heavily promoted. Non-compliance triggers steep penalties, for example, 1 million naira and higher. Virtual assets, service providers, VASPs, must report crypto digital asset transactions and adhere to KYC rules. Non-compliance risks license suspension and penalties up to 10 million naira for first month and subsequently 1 million naira per subsequent months. Tax Ombudsman Office established to handle disputes, complaints, and ensure fair tax governance. Tax reports and refund mechanism now bound by timelines. For example, validated refunds processed within 90 days, standardized disputes, and filing processes, they are all now introduced. The Nigerian Revenue Service Establishment Act 2025 has the following new provisions. It establishes the Nigerian Revenue Service, NRS, replacing the Federal Inland Revenue Service as a centralized federal revenue agency. The NRS has been given expanded authority with powers to collect and administer taxes on a wider scale. The agency is to assist other government levels, federal, state, local, in tax collection. They have the mandate. And to ensure transparency, the Nigerian Revenue Service must conduct annual audits within 6 months of fiscal year end and submit quarterly and annual activity reports, including audited accounts, to the National Assembly. The Nigerian Revenue Service is authorized to retain 4% of total revenue collected, excluding petroleum royalty, for funding its operations subject to appropriation, of course, by the National Assembly. Finally, under the Joint Revenue Board Establishment Act 2025, the following new provisions were made. Joint Revenue Board to coordinate revenue sharing and tax administration between federal and state governments. Tax Appeal Tribunal, an Office of the Tax Ombudsman established under this framework to harmonize dispute resolution and ensure coordinated tax governance. The NTA and NTAA will commence on 1st January 2026, while the NRSEA and JRBEA have a commencement date of 26 June 2025 to ensure readiness of the relevant institutions ahead of full implementation of the reforms in 2026. As we begin to wind up this lecture, it is important to talk about matters arising regarding the 5% fuel surcharge in the new tax laws. Most of us in the audience, having reported legislative activities for decades, know that the surcharge is not a new tax introduced by the current administration. The provision already exists under the Federal Roads Maintenance Agency Act 2007 as amended. Government has said that it is restated in the new tax act just for harmonization and transparency rather than for immediate implementation. It is also important to underpin the fact that the surcharge will not apply to all fuel products. Several energy products used by households are exempt. This includes household kerosene, cooking gas LPG, and compressed natural gas CNG. Clean and renewable energy products are also excluded to align with Nigeria's energy transition goals. It is also not true that the surcharge will automatically commence in January 2026 when the new tax laws come into effect, as widely claimed by some bad faith commentators. It will only commence when the Minister of Finance issues an order published in the official gazette, as stated under Chapter 7 of the Nigerian Tax Act 2025. These safeguards eliminates the possibility of any recklessness on the part of any key player and ensures careful consideration of timing and economic conditions of the citizens before implementation of the surcharge. This practice is virtually universal, as over 150 countries across the globe have imposed varying charges ranging from 20% to 80% of fuel products to guarantee regular investment in road infrastructure. No doubt, the NTAA 2025 mandates the use of tax identification numbers, tax ID, for certain transactions. Understandably, many Nigerians have questions about what this means for banking, business, and everyday life. Section 4 of the NTAA requires all taxable persons to register with the tax authority and obtain a tax ID. A taxable person in the law is defined as someone who carries on trade, business, or other economic activity to earn income. Banks and other financial institutions are required to request a tax ID from taxable persons, but individuals who do not earn income and do not fall within the definition of taxable persons are not required to obtain a tax ID. That being the case, ladies and gentlemen, it is now settled law, or the requirement of our law, that every taxable person, including artificial persons, must obtain a tax ID before opening or continuing to operate a bank account in Nigeria. The authorities have explained that the tax ID is a term that unifies the different TINs issued by the Federal Inland Revenue Service, Joint Tax Board, and State Inland Revenue Services. Ultimately, your NIN for individuals and CAC RC number for companies will serve as your tax ID, reducing duplication and simplifying compliance. Some of us here know that this is not a new policy. Since the Finance Act 2009, which amended Section 49 of the Personal Income Tax Act, since January 2020, individuals opening a business account have been required to provide a tax identification number, TIN. The NTAA only strengthens and harmonizes these requirements. All businesses, Nigerians in diaspora, foreign companies, and non-resident entities doing business in Nigeria, and all government-owned enterprises and agencies must register for tax and obtain a tax ID. Section 5 of the NTAA is explicitly clear on this. Challenges. Of course, there will be challenges in a groundbreaking reform like this. The first challenge relates to uncertainty. New rules bring new interpretations by the courts. How will this play out in practice? We do not know. What will be the stance of the newly empowered Nigerian Revenue Service in case it happens? The challenge of technology is obviously there. The drive towards full digitalization from e-invoicing to automated tax filings is a double-edged sword. It promises efficiency but demands a significant upgrade in our own digital capabilities and cyber security. The challenges of capacity. Do we have the skilled tax professionals within our businesses and within the government to manage this transition smoothly? There will be the challenge, of course. In the short time, compliance may cost more. It requires investment in new software, new training, and new advisory services. But ladies and gentlemen, tax reform is not a punishment. It is a pact. On our part as citizens, we must accept that this reform is more than a policy change. It is a national conversation. It is us telling ourselves that we are ready to build the Nigeria we deserve. Therefore, from the market stalls of Kano, Onitsha, to the corporate hubs of Lagos, let every legitimate enterprise become a threat in the strong fabric of our national revenue. The government must also understand that true tax reform is not about raising rates, but about raising trust. It is the covenant between government's promise and the people's prosperity. This is because transparency is the engine of compliance. When citizens can see where their naira goes, they are proud to give it. For it is not in vain that Lester B. Pearson, former Prime Minister of Canada, reminded us that the best way to teach people to pay their taxes is to let them see what they get for it. Let this reform be a pact between the government and the private sector, a promise that if we contribute diligently, the government will deploy those resources responsibly to build the roads we'll drive on, power the industries we'll run, build world-class hospitals for us, and educate the talent we hire. The waters ahead may be uncharted, but the destination is clear. A self-reliant, economically vibrant, and globally competitive Nigeria. In conclusion, the Nigerian Tax Act 2025 represents a structural shift towards a modernized, consolidated tax system aligned with international standards. While it promises greater clarity and potentially higher revenue mobilization, its success depends on predictable implementations, detailed regulations, and meaningful investment in administrative capacity and taxpayer readiness. Businesses and advisors should act now to map exposures, upgrade systems, and engage constructively with the tax administration. Taxpayers and the tax administrators must understand the new provisions so as to take advantage of the benefits they portend for them and the nation at large. Let me end this lecture by calling on Mr. President to ensure that he takes no prisoners in ensuring that this reform is implemented and sustained. This is a legacy that will impact generations after us and cement President Tinubu's place in Nigeria's history as the undisputed, most consequential economic reformer of our time. May we embrace this reform to build not just successful business, but a successful nation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your kind attention. May God bless us, and may God bless the Federal Republic of Nigeria.